The government, a dynamic institution that organizes society, ensures justice, and provides the structures necessary for the well-being, freedom, and prosperity of all its citizens, or at least most of the time. What happens when the government doesn't fulfill its responsibilities? A rebellion is sparked. One such rebellion in the 1780s shaped America into what it is today. It was Shays Rebellion. In 1786 to 1787, a series of uprisings by farmers in western Massachusetts erupted in response to high taxes, debt, and grievances. These revolts exposed the inability of the Articles of Confederation, which failed to provide a capable federal government. The unrest also demonstrated the pressing need for a democratic state government, one that could balance individual rights with the state's responsibility to maintain order.
Back in 1783, the Americans had defeated the British in the Revolutionary War. All 13 colonies had fought long and hard to finally gain independence after 7 perilous years. Once the war was over, all Americans were waiting for the return of their rights and were looking forward to a peaceful life. In reality, the aftermath was anything but peaceful. The federal government had borrowed money and weapons from other countries that they now needed to repay. They also owed pensions to the war veterans. This put the newly formed states in heavy debt.
Most states settled the situation peacefully. To decentralize the power, the states established their own constitution. However, in Massachusetts, the Constitution only allowed people with a higher economic status to vote. Therefore, the state policies favored the rich businessmen that lived on the East Coast, thus excluding the farmers in western Massachusetts. Since the government only based taxes off of property, the farmers in western Massachusetts were forced to pay unfairly heavy taxes. This was a violation of the farmers' rights, as the government wasn't fulfilling its responsibilities in a fair manner.
When the men fought in the Revolution, they were paid in worthless paper money. It lost its value as soon as it was printed. Then they were paid in promissory notes, and those promissory notes held their value because that was a promise from the government. But at the end of the war, they thought, we're not going to use these. We're not going to get money for these, so they gave them up.
Over time, speculators had collected these notes and were banking on being paid at the face value. James Bowdoin, the governor of Massachusetts, owned 3,290 pounds of these notes. Farmers were forced to use the notes at a discounted value, but were being taxed on the full value. When the government voted to pay those notes at full value, with 90% of the taxes falling on the people and 10% of them falling onto businesses, the people were shocked. This was a significant source of indignation for the farmers. The property of the farmers was at threat, raising more than 60% on land tax. In retrospect, every adult male would be taxed 3 British pounds per year, which is 1/3 of a typical farmer's income during the time. Farmers who were unable to meet these tax requirements would be taken to court, which eventually led them to the punishment of debtors' prisons. The farmers grew impatient and began to peacefully protest against the injustice in hope of gaining back their rights. One of the leaders of these protests was Daniel Shays.
Shays was a leader in the rebellion, although he was not the only one. One of the reasons he was prominent was because he had been a captain in the Revolutionary War. He was a captain in the Continental Army.
Shays and the other war veterans were angry about the fact that they had formed a new country to get away from taxes, but were now being asked to pay more taxes to the state. In August 1786, 1,000 angry farmers and unpaid veterans gathered to start an uprising. They called themselves the Regulators. They intended to shut down courts to prevent the judge from reaching a verdict. In the early revolts, rebels tried storming courthouses in Taunton, Concord, and Great Barrington. By September 1786, the movement had gained momentum, leading to more significant uprisings in Worcester County, where more than 1,500 farmers gathered to shut down the local courts. This marked a shift from sporadic protests to an organized armed resistance. However, they were stopped by the local militia.
By November, the rebels really wanted someone to get the rebellion off their backs. The state government also wanted an able leadership for the country, one which would guide them forward. Henry Knox used the uprising in Massachusetts to convince George Washington to come out of retirement and take care of the situation. Henry Knox was the one who eventually portrayed the uprisings as Shays Rebellion.
Samuel Adams also expressed his views on the rebellion by saying, "Rebellion against a king may be pardoned or lightly punished, but the man who dares to rebel against the laws of a republic ought to suffer death."
On September 20th, 1786, a group of 200 men from Rockingham County marched from Kingston to Exeter with the aim of forcing the legislature to print currency. The men eventually scattered after a brief exchange of gunfire.
On December 26, the rebels marched on Northampton in a bold attempt to shut down the local court. Although the rebels succeeded in temporarily halting court proceedings, the state militia responded forcefully, and the rebels were forced to retreat. Eventually, the regulators had to take a big step. They then marched to Springfield Arsenal. Springfield Arsenal was where the militia stored their muskets, gunpowder, ammunition, and cannons.
On January 25, 1787, the regulators, who were mostly unarmed, went to the arsenal to seize its weapons before the state militia acquired them. However, when they arrived, they were faced by the armed militia who had arrived there before them. The militia fired cannons in the air to drive the regulators away, but that did not deter Shays' men. They advanced further. The militia then fired at them, killing 2 men and injuring 4. The regulators were too weak and scattered into the hills of Pelham. On February 4th, the Battle of Petersham was one of the final confrontations where government forces successfully defeated the rebels, capturing several insurgents. On February 27th, the rebellion faced its final defeat at Dover, where a remaining fraction of rebels were decisively crushed by state troops. Shays, along with many other leaders, were forced to flee into other states and go into hiding to avoid arrest.
The rebels may have lost every one of their battles, but their actions forced the government to listen to the little men and acknowledge their plea for unrecognized rights. Shays' Rebellion almost caused a civil war in Massachusetts. This made the federal government realize the inability of the Articles of Confederation to fulfill its responsibilities and handle such a crisis. Following the rebellion, the state election took place. The voter turnout in Massachusetts increased drastically due to the need for change in leadership. John Hancock defeated Bowdoin. Hancock took immediate action by pardoning the farmers, cutting the taxes, and giving the farmers more time to pay. Western Massachusetts was also included in the General Assembly. Eventually, the weaknesses exposed from the rebellion caught the eye of national leaders such as George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, who became convinced of forming a stronger federal government. Hence, they formed a convention of delegators named the Constitutional Convention. They met in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in May of 1787, where they ultimately laid the foundation of the Constitution, which the whole country runs under even today.
So you can say that in a sort of indirect way, the Constitution is an outcome of Shays' Rebellion.
The conclusion of the rebellion also allowed the federal government to take a stand. The federal government started collecting taxes from the state, getting more funds. These funds could help them keep a situation like the rebellion under control in the future. Ultimately, the newly drafted Constitution gave the federal government more authority. Even though most viewed the rebellion as a catastrophe for years to come, few people also welcomed it. Thomas Jefferson wrote in a letter to James Madison saying, "I hold it that a little rebellion now and then is a good thing." In addition, in his letter to Colonel William Smith, he quoted, "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants." Many historians today also view Shays' Rebellion as a catalyst for the Constitution. The uprising in Massachusetts showed the inability of the Confederation to respond effectively, calling for a stronger central authority. When a government gains power, it has to realize its responsibilities in order to ensure the rights of its citizens.
In some ways, of course, that's still the issue. What rights do people have if the government doesn't do the things it's supposed to do for them?
Shays' Rebellion highlighted the consequences when the government fails to uphold its responsibilities. Though it was crushed, its message endured. A government must be accountable to its people, for true liberty is rooted in the protection of their rights.